It began like so many missing child cases, Dow, with a mother's frantic call to police, claiming her teenage son had run away. The woman on the other end of the line was Rachel Miller, a 40-year-old mother of two who lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Her voice trembled as she reported that her 15-year-old son, Jacob, had vanished in the middle of the night. According to her, he had packed a small backpack, left a note saying he couldn't take life at home anymore, and disappeared into the darkness. On the surface, the story sounded tragically familiar. Teenagers running away from home was nothing new, especially when there was tension within a family. But something in Rachel's voice, something in the details she gave, or rather, didn't give, immediately raised suspicions among the first officers on scene. The so-called note Jacob had left behind was barely a sentence long, scrawled in shaky handwriting on a torn piece of notebook paper. "I can't stay here. Don't look for me." No signature, no explanation, no trace of where he might have gone. Police conducted the standard first steps, searching the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking friends if they'd seen or heard from Jacob. Nothing. His friends swore he hadn't mentioned leaving home. No one had received a text or a call. His social media was suddenly silent. Rachel, meanwhile, wept on her couch, repeating the same phrase over and over. He just wanted to get away. He just wanted to leave. At first, detectives considered her a grieving mother, but then they noticed something strange. The house itself felt off. The curtains were always drawn. The rooms were dim, cluttered, and cold despite the warm spring air outside. And there was one room, the basement, that Rachel seemed determined to keep closed. She explained it away quickly. "Oh, it's just storage. My late husband kept tools down there. It's a mess, really. No need to go poking around." But detectives would later remember the way she said it. Too fast, too rehearsed, and how her hands had trembled when they reached toward that locked door. For now, though, with no evidence of foul play, police classified Jacob Miller as a runaway. Flyers were printed. Local news stations reported on the missing boy. Volunteers joined search efforts. Weeks passed, and all the while the basement door stayed shut. What no one knew then was that Jacob hadn't run away at all. He was closer than anyone imagined, and the basement was holding a secret darker than anyone was prepared to face. The first weeks of Jacob's disappearance played out like many missing persons cases. Flyers with his school photo plastered across them appeared on utility poles and shop windows. Local news anchors spoke his name night after night, urging anyone with information to come forward. But beneath the surface, investigators were growing uneasy. Detective Laura Henderson, one of the original investigators on the case, noticed a pattern in Rachel's interviews. The grieving mother seemed eager to talk about how rebellious Jacob supposedly was, how he never listened, how he always wanted more freedom, how he threatened to leave whenever arguments got heated. It was almost as if Rachel was working too hard to convince the world that her son was troubled enough to run away. When detectives asked for recent photos of Jacob, Rachel handed them a school portrait that was over a year old. His hair was shorter in the picture, his face less mature. It was hardly the image of the boy his friends described. When they pressed her for something more recent, she stalled. "Oh, I'm not very good with technology," she said, fumbling with her phone. "He hated pictures anyway." Another red flag. Jacob's friends told a very different story. They described him as quiet but dependable, a boy who loved basketball and dreamed of studying engineering. He wasn't the type to storm off without a word. If he had a problem, one classmate said, he'd talk about it. He didn't just disappear. Even Jacob's younger sister, Emily, seemed confused by her mother's version of events. In a soft, hesitant voice, she told detectives, "Jacob never said anything to me about leaving. He loved it here. Well, mostly." When asked what she meant by mostly, Emily clammed up. Detectives weren't sure if it was fear, loyalty, or something else that silenced her, but it left them with a gnawing sense that something was being hidden. It was during a routine follow-up visit that Detective Henderson noticed the locked basement door again. The same heavy padlock hung across it, the same stale odor of dust and mildew seeping through the crack beneath. Rachel repeated her story about it being storage. her tone sharper this time, her eyes flashing with irritation. "Why do you keep asking about the basement? It's nothing, just junk." Henderson didn't press, at least not yet. With no warrant and no evidence, her hands were tied. But she made a mental note. If Jacob hadn't run away, then where was he? And why was Rachel so determined to keep that door closed? As weeks stretched into months, hope of finding Jacob alive began to fade. But then came the tips. The first was anonymous. Someone claiming they'd seen Rachel shopping alone at odd hours, buying more groceries than a single mother and daughter would reasonably need. The second tip came from a neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Pratt, who lived across the street. She told detectives that late at night, she sometimes heard muffled sounds coming from the Miller house. "At first I thought it was the television," she said, "but then I realized it was more like crying or someone calling out." Still, without solid proof, police couldn't move forward. They had suspicions, whispers, and a locked door. But suspicions weren't enough to open it. And so the case cooled. The flyers came down. The news cycle moved on. For the public, Jacob Miller had become just another missing boy whose story ended in silence. But inside the Miller home, the silence was anything but ordinary. Because Jacob wasn't gone. He was right there, waiting for someone to find him. 3 years passed. By then, Jacob Miller's name had all but vanished from the headlines. His mother, Rachel, still maintained the story that her son had run away, though her public appearances grew fewer and fewer. Emily had grown into a quiet young woman, always in her mother's shadow, rarely seen outside the home. The Miller house itself seemed frozen in time. Same drawn curtains, same locked basement door, same uneasy silence. The case might have remained cold forever, if not for a new detective. Detective Mark Alvarez, assigned to the department's cold case unit, stumbled upon Jacob's file while reviewing unresolved missing person reports. Something about it gnawed at him. The runaway note, barely legible, unsigned, the mother's strange evasiveness, the whispers from neighbors about late-night cries. Alvarez had worked enough cases to recognize when a story didn't add up. "This isn't a runaway," he told his partner. "This is a cover-up." Alvarez began combing through old reports, re-interviewing Jacob's friends, and tracking down neighbors who'd lived near the Millers at the time of the disappearance. What he found only deepened his suspicions. Mrs. Pratt, the neighbor across the street, had more to say now than she had 3 years earlier. "I didn't want to get involved back then," she admitted, "but I still remember those nights. The sounds, like someone was begging. And then silence, like they were being hushed." Another neighbor recalled Rachel's obsessive need for privacy, curtains drawn 24/7. No one invited inside. And the groceries, large quantities delivered to the house, though Rachel insisted she and Emily barely ate. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but there was still one problem: no evidence. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Alvarez was running background checks when he noticed something peculiar: Rachel Miller's credit card history. For years, she had consistently purchased items that didn't match her lifestyle. Protein powder, energy bars, bulk bottled water. Things that might make sense for a teenager, but not for a woman and her daughter living alone. Then came the most chilling discovery: receipts for heavy-duty locks, chains, and replacement padlocks, all purchased after Jacob's so-called disappearance. Alvarez's instincts screamed at him now. Whatever was behind that basement door, it wasn't just storage. Armed with this information, Alvarez visited the Miller home. Rachel answered the door, older but still carrying the same nervous energy noted in the original reports. She bristled at his questions, her tone defensive, almost hostile. "Why can't you people let this go?" she snapped. "My son left. He didn't want to be here. Isn't that enough?" But Alvarez didn't back down. He pressed harder, circling back to the basement, casually asking if she minded showing him around. Rachel's face drained of color. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. "No one goes down there," she said flatly. Her eyes locked on his, cold and unblinking. "Not now, not ever." That was all Alvarez needed to hear. He left the house that day more convinced than ever that Jacob Miller hadn't run away. He was still there, trapped in the shadows beneath his own home. The problem was convincing a judge to sign off on a warrant without direct evidence. Alvarez needed something concrete, something undeniable. No, and fate was about to hand it to him. Oh, and Detective Alvarez knew he was on the edge of something, but he also knew the law. Without probable cause, without proof beyond suspicions and uneasy neighbors' whispers, he couldn't force his way into Rachel Miller's basement. That proof came from the last place he expected, Rachel's own daughter. One afternoon, Alvarez stopped Emily outside the house as she returned from a grocery run. She was 19 now, but the weight of years spent under her mother's shadow clung to her like chains. At first, she resisted speaking, her eyes darting nervously toward the drawn curtains. But when Alvarez gently pressed, assuring her she wasn't in trouble, the words spilled out in a trembling whisper. "You're looking in the right place," she said, her voice cracked. "You just have to go downstairs." Alvarez's chest tightened. He asked if Jacob was alive. Emily's silence was answer enough. With Emily's testimony, Alvarez finally had grounds. He wasted no time drafting an affidavit for a search warrant, citing the suspicious purchases, the neighbors' accounts, and now the direct statement from Rachel's own daughter. The judge signed off within hours. By dawn the next day, a convoy of police vehicles rolled quietly into the Miller neighborhood. Officers fanned out, securing the perimeter, while Alvarez approached the door with a warrant in hand. Rachel answered in a robe, her face pale and tight. When Alvarez presented the document, she froze. For a moment, it seemed she might resist. Then, with a low, bitter laugh, she stepped aside. "You'll regret this," she hissed. The basement door was just as Alvarez remembered. Solid wood, heavy padlock glinting under the dim hallway light. Officers crowded behind him as a bolt cutter snapped through the steel. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the silent house. Oh, the door creaked open. A rush of stale, damp air spilled out. Flashlights cut into the darkness, revealing a narrow staircase leading down. The deeper they went, the stronger the stench of mildew, sweat, and something else, something human. At the bottom of the stairs, the beams of light swept across a scene that froze every man in his tracks. The space was small, claustrophobic, and suffocating. Bare concrete walls glistened with damp. A thin, stained mattress lay crumpled on the floor. Rusted chains hung from bolts embedded in the wall, their ends worn and scratched from years of desperate tugging. Food wrappers and plastic water bottles littered the floor, alongside old books and tattered clothes. And in the far corner, shielding his eyes from the sudden burst of light, was Jacob Miller. Gaunt, pale, his hair long and matted, his frame thin to the point of fragility. But unmistakably him. The boy who was supposed to have run away 3 years ago. For a moment, no one moved. The officers were too stunned, Jacob too weak to believe what he was seeing. Then Alvarez stepped forward slowly, lowering his flashlight. "Jacob," he said gently, "we're here to take you home." The teenager's lips trembled. His voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible. "Don't let her come back." Behind them, Rachel Miller was screaming from upstairs, restrained by officers as she fought against her cuffs. Her shrill voice echoed down into the basement. "He belongs to me. You don't understand. He belongs here." But her son, after 3 years in the dark, knew better than anyone exactly what that basement meant. Jacob was rushed to the hospital that same night. Paramedics described him as severely malnourished and barely hanging on. His body told a story of years spent in confinement, sunken cheeks, brittle hair, muscles wasted from disuse. Doctors estimated he had lost nearly half his body weight since his last medical records. But he was alive. Against all odds, he had survived. It took days before Jacob was strong enough to speak. Even then, his words came haltingly, as though each syllable carried the weight of years. Detectives Alvarez and Henderson sat quietly by his hospital bed as he began to recount what had really happened the night he supposedly ran away. "I never left," Jacob whispered. "She locked me down there. Said I wasn't allowed to go outside anymore. According to Jacob, the nightmare began shortly after his father died. Rachel grew increasingly controlling, paranoid that her children would abandon her. When Jacob resisted, asking for independence, talking about college, her paranoia turned into cruelty. One night during an argument, she dragged him downstairs and locked the door behind him. At first, he thought it was temporary punishment, but days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and then years. Rachel brought him food just enough to keep him alive. She rationed water, forced him to sleep on the concrete floor, and forbade Emily from speaking to him unless she was present. When he tried to fight back, she chained him to the wall. She told me the world was dangerous, Jacob said, his eyes filling with tears. She said I'd thank her one day for keeping me safe. As investigators dug deeper, a disturbing picture emerged of Rachel Miller's mindset. Psychologists who later evaluated her described classic signs of pathological control and dependency. She could not bear the thought of losing her children, so she decided to imprison them, literally, in her home. Emily, though spared the basement, lived under constant surveillance. Rachel controlled her every move, monitoring phone calls, restricting friendships, dictating where she could go and when. Her existence was quieter, less visible, but no less suffocating. But Jacob, as the older sibling, represented a greater threat to Rachel's fragile grip. His desire for independence, his plans for the future, they terrified her. And so she removed the threat the only way she knew how, by locking him away. When news of Jacob's rescue broke, the community reeled. Neighbors who had lived across the street for years struggled to comprehend how such horror had unfolded in plain sight. Mrs. Pratt, the neighbor who'd once heard muffled cries, broke down in tears during interviews. "I should have done more," she sobbed. "I should have kept calling. Maybe he wouldn't have been trapped so long." The story dominated headlines. Basement prisoner rescued after 3 years. Journalists camped outside the Miller home, cameras flashing as police hauled out bags of evidence, chains, padlocks, and the mattress that bore silent witness to Jacob's suffering. Rachel Miller herself became the face of evil in the eyes of the public. She had presented herself as a grieving mother, pleading for sympathy, while secretly hiding the very boy she claimed to miss. Emily, now free from her mother's grasp, struggled with conflicting emotions. She loved her brother and wept openly during their hospital reunion, but she also carried immense guilt for never speaking sooner. "She made me promise not to tell," Emily confessed. "She said if I did, we'd both be punished. I thought keeping quiet was the only way to protect us." Jacob, frail but resolute, reassured her. "It wasn't your fault," he told her softly. "She had us both trapped, but we're free now." For the first time in years, brother and sister embraced without the shadow of their mother looming over them. Rachel Miller's arrest sent shockwaves through the county. What had once been classified as a routine runaway case was now one of the most disturbing crimes the region had ever seen. The charges were swift and severe: kidnapping, false imprisonment, child abuse, neglect causing great bodily harm. Prosecutors argued for the maximum penalties, describing Rachel's actions as calculated cruelty under the disguise of motherhood. The trial drew national attention. News crews filled the courthouse steps each morning, their cameras capturing every flicker of Rachel's expression. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. On one side, prosecutors presented the case of a mother who had weaponized her role, transforming her home into a prison. On the other side, Rachel's defense attorneys painted a picture of a mentally unstable woman gripped by grief after the death of her husband. Rachel herself often appeared defiant, glaring at reporters and even at her own children when they were called to testify. "I never hurt him," she insisted on the stand, her voice sharp. "I protected him. The world out there, it would have chewed him up and spat him out. I kept him safe." Her words, far from evoking sympathy, only solidified the image of a woman disconnected from reality. The most harrowing moment of the trial came when Jacob himself testified. Weak but determined, he told the jury what life had been like in the basement: the chains, the hunger, the endless nights of darkness. His voice cracked as he recalled listening to his sister's footsteps above, knowing she was as trapped as he was, though in a different way. "She took everything from me," Jacob said, his eyes fixed on his mother across the courtroom. "My childhood, my freedom. I wasn't living, I was just surviving." The jury listened in silence, the weight of his words settling like a stone. Emily, too, took the stand. Though racked with guilt, she bravely admitted the truth. She had known Jacob was in the basement. She had wanted to tell someone, but was paralyzed by fear of her mother's threats. "She told me if I ever opened my mouth, Jacob would disappear forever," Emily said, her hands trembling. "I thought she meant she would kill him. So I stayed quiet, and that's something I'll never forgive myself for." Her testimony painted the full picture. Rachel's house was not a home but a place ruled by manipulation, control, and fear. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Rachel Miller sat stone-faced as the judge delivered her sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted with relief. For Jacob and Emily, it marked the official end of years of torment. For the community, it was closure to a story that had haunted them for too long. As bailiffs led Rachel away in shackles, she turned once toward her children. Her lips curled into a faint smile. "You'll thank me one day," she muttered. But Jacob and Emily looked away. For them, the nightmare was over. The trial was over, but the scars remained. For Jacob and Emily, freedom was both a blessing and a burden. They were no longer prisoners in their own home, but stepping into the world after years of isolation was overwhelming. Jacob's recovery was slow and painful. Physically, he required months of medical care to regain weight and rebuild strength. Psychologically, the wounds ran deeper. He struggled with nightmares, sudden panic when in confined spaces, and an unshakable distrust of authority figures. But he was determined. With therapy, patience, and the unwavering support of counselors and advocates, Jacob began reclaiming pieces of the life stolen from him. He returned to his studies, setting his sights once again on the engineering career he had once dreamed of. Emily's path was equally difficult. Though she had not endured the basement herself, the guilt of silence weighed heavily on her. Counselors reminded her that she too was a victim, that her mother's manipulation had controlled her every action. Slowly, Emily began to believe it. She pursued independence, enrolling in college courses, making friends for the first time without her mother's shadow looming overhead. She spoke at community events about the dangers of coercive control, becoming a voice for survivors who were too afraid to speak. The case forced the community to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil can exist behind the most ordinary of doors. Neighbors who had once dismissed their unease about the Miller home now admitted they wished they had pushed harder, called louder, done more. "It's easy to ignore the warning signs," Mrs. Pratt said in a local interview. "But if you feel something's wrong, trust your gut. I'll never stop regretting that I didn't." For law enforcement, Jacob's ordeal became a case study. Training materials highlighted the importance of re-examining so-called runaways, questioning narratives that didn't align with facts, and never overlooking something as simple as a locked basement door. Detective Alvarez, hailed as the hero who broke the case, remained humble. "All I did," he said, "was listen. Listen to what didn't make sense. Listen to the silence. Sometimes silence tells the loudest story." Jacob and Emily's story is not one of total tragedy. Though years were stolen, their freedom was restored. Though the basement marked them with scars, it did not define their future. But the haunting reality lingers. For 3 long years, a mother convinced the world her son had run away. And all the while, the truth was buried just beneath their feet, hidden in the shadows of a locked basement. Don't forget to subscribe to Criminal Minds Archives for more chilling true crime stories that uncover the darkest corners of human nature.